Hi again, one last time, everybody. I'm going to try to deliver a final lecture on Jonson's Bartholomew Fair and a final lecture for our course. There is an incredible amount, I think, still to talk about in Jonson's play. It's unbelievably rich and strange and wonderful. I've talked before about the way in which Jonson's comic plots don't really proceed in a linear fashion. It's more like they circulate around either London as a whole or Bartholomew Fair in the case of this play. And it's a bit like Hotel California. It feels like you can check up, but you can never leave. We have to finish up our look at this play, or we'll be stuck here forever. I certainly hope that it has been interesting for you guys. It certainly has been interesting to me. I've been, regrettably, that it has been just me. I've been talking over the last several lectures on this play about the topic of festivity. And in particular, in the last lecture, I was emphasizing the carnivalesque aspect of festivity, that emphasis on the body, on loss of control, on a kind of careening into amorality or moral incontinence, which seems to be anthropologically immanent within the phenomenon of festivity. So this is festive time, festive space, like the world of Bartholomew Fair, where people lose themselves, where they lose control. And what I want to try to talk about this evening, in an attempt to close out our look at this play and to conclude our course, is I want to try to talk about what Jonson's attitude seems to be toward this kind of loss of control. We will expect, and I think we'll be right, we will expect that Jonson will have a negative attitude toward loss of control because it's inconsistent with that very conservative humanism that he has and that we've talked about before. And yet, Jonson's comic imagination in this play seems so incredibly at home in the world of Bartholomew Fair that I think our idea going in has to be that it's ambiguous. On the one hand, this play, Bartholomew Fair, is clearly Jonson's comic masterpiece. And I hope you would agree with me that there are many times in reading this play, and admittedly it's difficult, but there are many times in reading this play, I hope you would agree with this, where you find yourself saying, oh my God, that is absolutely brilliant, and unlike anything else I've ever seen before. I think there are many times like that, when you realize in reading Bartholomew Fair, you are reading a unique work of art. To offer a perhaps trivial analogy, but I don't think it is, I just recently finished watching the movie Uncut Gems on Netflix, of course. If it's not on Netflix, it doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned. Uncut Gems, this very, very remarkable and I think groundbreaking movie starring Adam Sandler in a non-comedic role. I mention it in this context just because when I'm watching a film like that, and it's an exhausting movie, I actually had to do it in bits and pieces. I'm watching a film like that, and I'm like, I don't understand this at all, and yet it seems to me a really significant document. I think Jonson's Bartholomew Fair is a little bit like that. It is crazy brilliant. And yet it's not clear how he feels about its crazy brilliance, or really how anybody felt about its crazy brilliance. This play, as I have mentioned before, was performed twice, exactly twice, in Jonson's lifetime. It had a kind of double premiere and then it's never seen again. Um, what do we infer from that? Well, I guess one thing we could think is that maybe this play wasn't liked very much. Maybe it's too extreme, the comedy of Bartholomew Fair. And we'll get this evening into some of the very extreme aspects of Jonson's comedy in this play. When Jonson printed his plays in 1616, just 2 years after this work, he didn't include it. He doesn't publish Bartholomew Fair, not until much later in his life. So it is a stunning work, an exhausting work, a brilliant work, and yet a work to which it seems even its author has kind of an ambiguous attitude. So let's try, at least, to find our way through and out of Bartholomew Fair in the next 40 minutes or so. And if I can make it shorter, I will, but I doubt if I will succeed in that. And let's begin like this. In terms of our previous work with this play, we're now around about halfway through. We're looking at Act 3 and subsequently. And certainly one thing that happens as this play goes forward is it gathers pace in a kind of unbelievable comic mayhem. I've mentioned before the way in which Jonson's comic imagination works through a kind of episodic structure, almost the way in which the writing of a sitcom or something like that would work. He has some ideas for bits that he really likes, and he finds ways to string them together. In Bartholomew Fair, Jonson's comic imagination is just absolutely on overdrive, both in terms of the sheer number and variety of comic scenes that he has come up with, and also in terms of the way in which they interrelate, and in terms of this gathering pace of comic mayhem that we find as we go through Act 3 and on toward Acts 4 and 5 in the play. And for the most part now, I'm just going to summarize some stuff that happens rather than turning to the text, but we'll do that when we absolutely need to. In Act 3, we are introduced to a new character, an Irish character who speaks. His lines are written in what Jonson thinks of as a kind of stage Irish. How successful that is, I'm not sure in the period, but that's what they're supposed to be. This character's name is Wit, W-H-I-T. He is closely associated with this other man, Dan Knockham, and like Knockham, Wit is a pimp. But much more explicitly than the other guy is. In Act 3, Scene 2, we have Wit very frankly offering the services of prostitutes to Quarles and Winwife, both of whom he recognizes and knows by name, which is, of course, meant to be rather telling. So we are... we are slipping downhill morally in Act 3 of Bartholomew Fair. Earlier, when we met this character Knockham, he was described as a horse courser, so supposedly he's a horse trader. He's really a pimp, but it's sort of a little bit under wraps. When Wit comes on the scene in Act 3, those wraps are taken off. These men are trading in sexual services, and they are absolutely frank and open about that in the festive world of Bartholomew Fair. Act 3, Scene 2, later on, our main characters finally come on. By our main characters, I mean John Littlewit and his family. That's his wife, Gwyn, her mum, Dame Purecraft, and the Puritan man, Zeal of the Land Busy. It's a rather nice touch, subtle touch, but very good in this moment of Jonson's comedy that the Puritan family doesn't even get here until Act 3. In other words, they don't arrive until the party has really gotten going. And then in they come in Act 3, Scene 2. They have come to the fair, you will recall, at least officially, so to speak. They have come to the fair only to satisfy Wynn's longing for pork. That's the stratagem that she and John Littlewhite come up with to enable them to go see the fair against the objections, or over the objections of her Puritan mom and zeal of the land busy. And from the other way around, it's under a pretense of only wanting to satisfy Wynn's longing for pork that Purecraft and Busy have decided to come to the fair, as I've said in a previous lecture, in a sense showing how pure they are, hypocritically, by agreeing to participate in something extremely impure, something like Bartholomew Fair. They finally come on in Act 3, Scene 2, and they enter Ursula's booth to eat pork. With Knockham, the character Knockham, kind of inviting them in or persuading them to come into Ursula's booth to eat. Now, Ursula initially is annoyed at Knockham over this. She's like, I want customers who are going to eat a lot and drink a lot. These people are Puritans. They're no good to me. Knockham assures her, however, and this of course is consistent with Jonson's satire on the Puritans, Knockham assures her, no, they're hypocrites. They will drink more and eat more than anybody you have ever seen. And in fact, that turns out to be largely true. By Act 3, Scene 6, Busy, emerging from Ursula's booth, evidently very drunk, has become a kind of exhibit in the fair himself. He's ranting and sermonizing. People are gathering around to kind of watch the show of this Puritan, freak job, yelling. And in the height of his zeal, he overturns the gingerbread stall belonging to the character called Joan Trash. He makes an actual mess. So the Puritans, and this is Jonson's critique, the Puritans who claim not to want to have anything to do with a place like Bartholomew Fair, they're actually extremely at home there. Zeal of the land busy becomes himself a force for disorder, for breaking rules, for making a mess. And he's very proud of it. And he's proud of it in part, of course, because he is very drunk. A state of affairs in which we can do terrible things that we are, in that moment, very proud of. Or at least I've heard. After that point, Act 3, Scene 6, this disciplined little party of John Littlewhite's family, it starts to come apart. And in fact, everything starts to come apart in the play after approximately this point. First of all, Busy gets arrested because, of course, there is law in the fair, something we need to come back to one more time, at least this evening. There's law in the fair. There are watchmen, as they're called, or security guards, policemen. They come and they arrest Busy for causing as much mess as he's caused. As we have discussed, in festivity, you're following the rules by breaking the rules, because that's what festivity is. But then you're breaking the rules if you break the rules too much, if you go too far. That's that paradoxical or slippery knife edge on which festivity teeters. Busy is arrested for going too far. He gets carried away and joins a small cohort of characters in the latter half of this play who spend time in the stocks, the traditional mechanism of punishment and humiliation in medieval and Renaissance Europe, where your hands and or feet are placed inside a wooden framework, and you have to sit there for a while being very uncomfortable and usually being mocked. Wasp, Bartholomew Coaks's tutor, spends time in the stocks, again for freaking out, for becoming festively disordered, and so does Justice Overdue himself. We verge into utter mayhem in Jonson's play as we go from Act 3 into Act 4. In Act 4, Scene 3, all of a sudden, Quarles and Winwife, remember they're the two guys who were kind of after Dame Purecraft, Win's widowed and rich mum. All of a sudden, Quarles and Winwife in Act 4, Scene 3, they come tumbling on stage, and they are both violently in love with Grace Wellborn. Remember, she is the young lady who is supposed to marry Bartholomew Coakes, who is an idiot. She doesn't want to do that because he's an idiot, but she's the ward of Justice Overdue, which means basically he is selling her into marriage with Bartholomew Coakes. Nonetheless, in the context of the fair, she's managed to make the acquaintance of Quarles and Winwife. They have both fallen completely in love with her, like that. And Act 4, Scene 3, they suddenly both come on stage with their swords drawn, ready to fight to the death over this young woman whom they have just met. It is completely ridiculous. I mean, Jonson knows that it's completely ridiculous. This is the kind of thing that can only happen in a space and a time like Bartholomew Fair. And the Quarles Winwife Grace Wellborn triangle gets even more ridiculous because they make this agreement that, and it's incredibly difficult to summarize. The next person they see will write a word in a book, and that will determine which of these men that Grace Wellborn will spend the rest of her life with. I'm doing a terrible job of summarizing this little aspect of Jonson's comic plot, and yet it almost doesn't matter because it is so utterly, brilliantly absurd. What happens in the end, of course, is that the person they meet is the madman Trouble-All, and I want to come back to him. And Grace Wellborn, in the end, indeed, decides to marry and spend the rest of her life with the man between Quarles and Winwife, with the one who was chosen, in essence, randomly, by lot, by a crazy person, Trouble-All. We are in deep festivity here. Rules, norms, reason, everything going by the wayside. Passion, chance, arbitrariness rule as the mayhem of Jonson's Bartholomew Fair comes toward its crescendo. And at the crescendo of the craziness of the fair in Act 4 of Jonson's play, we find our way being marked by one of those technical terms that I introduced in the last lecture to help us to talk about festivity and the traditions of festivity in Renaissance literature. The term was scatology, literally, as I said, or etymologically meaning the logic or the study of shit, but more broadly, this wonderful term, scatology, is one that we use for the whole phenomenon of bodily functions. The scatological function, which ends up playing a very, very important role in the festive crescendo of Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, is peeing, specifically women's peeing. And I do think that even if Jonson is a hard guy to make friends with to some extent, there are some very interesting moments in Ben Jonson where he demonstrates a sensitivity to women's lives that one does not meet that much in Renaissance English literature, insofar as it is almost exclusively written by men. I'm thinking, for example, I'm thinking for the example of the moment in Every Man Out of His Humor when Phalas goes into her private chamber to fantasize about the courtier fastidious Brisk. That's a moment, as I said at the time, of a kind of female erotic empowerment. I take it. And here, perhaps an even stronger version of the point, what happens, although admittedly the end of the story is not as good as the beginning, but what happens in these crazy scenes of Act 4 of Jonson's Bartholomew Fair is that women need to pee. First of all, Wynne, John Littlewhit's wife, needs to pee. She says to her husband, "I've got great whatchamacallem," after they've come out of eating and drinking in Ursula's booth, and accordingly they go back to the booth to find something for Wynne to pee in. So, typical story, of course. Whenever you go to a festival, there's not enough porta potties, right? And even more typical story, the people who suffer most from the lack of porta potties are women. That lineup at the women's washroom was always much longer than the one of the guys. It's not fair, and Jonson is maybe a little bit sensitive to that. Women's bodies becoming a problem, a special problem within this festive context. Then later, Mistress Overdue needs to go too, and now I'll turn to the text. It's going to be Act 4, Scene 4, line 191 is where I will pick it up. Act 4, Scene 4, line 191. At this point, Mistress Overdue and Wynne have already made the acquaintance of Whit, the Irish pimp, and he notices that Mistress Overdue is in a little bit of discomfort, and he says to her, "How now, woman of shirk, what ails thy sweet face?" That's something like Jonson's stage Irish. "Art thou melancholy? What's wrong?" he asks her. Mrs. Overdue says, "A little distempered with these enormities. Shall I entreat a courtesy of you, Captain?" Whit says, "Entreat 100, velvet woman. I will do it. Speak out." Mrs. Overdue says, "I cannot with modesty speak of it." Whit immediately figures, "Oh, of course, you need the bathroom." So he goes to Ursula and says, this classy lady, Mistress Overdue, needs to pee. Ursula, and I'm now down at line 210, Ursula says, "Let her sell her hood and buy a sponge with a pox to her. My vessel is employed, sir. I have but one, and 'tis the bottom of an old bottle. An honest proctor and his wife are at it within, if she'll stay her time so." We are heading toward the bottom of Jonson's festive porta potty, I think, at this point of Bartholomew Fair, as the fundamental need to relieve oneself becomes a site of disgust, of humiliation, of double entendre. For Ursula to say, "An honest proctor and his wife are at it within." On the one hand, it means they're using my can. On the other hand, the double entendre is it's like they are doing it inside. So we are sinking down into the stalls of the toilet in the comic, disorderly, festive, carnivalesque crescendo of this play, and it gets worse and very quickly worse and a lot worse. In Act 4, Scene 5, Wynne and John Littlewhit emerge from having used Ursula's bottle. Littlewhit immediately says, "Okay, I gotta go," because he has this puppet show of which he is the author, and which he needs to go supervise. So it's a kind of replay almost of Act 1, Scene 1, where he was seemingly abandoning his beautiful young wife Win to the attention of two other men. So if we turn to Act 4, Scene 5, from the very beginning, from lines 1 to 10, which I will just mostly summarize. Little Wit comes on saying, okay, thanks very much, Urs, for letting us use your toilet. I've got this puppet show I have to supervise. I gotta go, bye. And Win says at line 7, will you leave me alone with two men, John? Little Wit says, they are honest gentlemen, Win. Captain Jordan and Captain Wit, they'll use you very civilly, Win. God be with you, Win. Off he goes. Leaving Win with these two men, Jordan, Knockham is the way he's called in the character designations, and Wit, who are easily the two dodgiest people we have met in the very dodgy world of Bartholomew Fair. Both of them pimps in the business of selling women's sexual services. And instantly, in Act 4, Scene 5, and in very frank, very bawdy, very salacious terms, Knockham and Wit decide to convert both of these proper middle-class women, Win and Mistress Overdue, into prostitutes. And in the world of Bartholomew Fair, they are both up for that. At Act 4, Scene 5, we can pick it up from line 29. Wit is saying to Win, the honest woman's life is a scurvy dull life indeed, la. Win says, how, sir? Is an honest woman's life a scurvy life? Wit says, yes, fate, sweetheart, believe him, the life of a bondwoman. But if thou would hearken to me, I'll make thee a free woman and a lady. The scene goes on like that, with Wit and Knockham, for example, promising Win she can sleep with 20 guys and yet be honest. She's going to have a fantastic life as a prostitute. The scene ends with both Win and Mistress Overdue going off stage to be fitted with what are called green gowns, which means gowns in the color green. Prostitutes in early modern England wore as a kind of uniform either green or yellow dresses. The idea being that that's the color your clothes get if you're rolling around in the grass a lot. That's where Act 4 kind of comes to its incredible, disorderly, scatological, carnivalesque conclusion, with these two women entering the sex trade, or at least being on the very cusp of entering the sex trade. In the end, they don't, but they are heading that way, and in fact willingly heading that way, or so it seems. And with that, we are presumably at the bottom of the festive toilet, a festive world where wrong is right. When Win and Mistress Overdue are on the cusp of prostitution, something presumably has gone wrong. And the question that I think Jonson is posing is what? How do we get to a point like that? A point at which the audience may well be laughing belly laughs. But I'm not sure that Jonson himself is sharing in those belly laughs when Win and Mistress Overdue are going off stage to get fitted with their green gowns. What has gone wrong here? What's the problem? Well, I'm going to try to move this toward a conclusion fairly quickly. I think the answer to that question, what's wrong with this festive picture? The answer to that question may be given, or at least indicated, by the madman character whose name is Trouble-All. And you'll remember he's the character who keeps coming on in scene after scene, demanding to know if people have justice overdue's warrant. So he has gotten in trouble with Justice Overdue in previous fairs, and accordingly, he's lost his mind. He thinks you can't do anything unless Justice Overdue says it's okay. You've got to have a warrant signed and sealed from Justice Overdue, if you want to say hello or have a cup of tea or take a shit. That's the kind of crazy that this madman Trouble is in. Now that's absurd. It's a totally absurd, ridiculous relationship to law and to authority. And I think, I emphasize think, this is not from the burning bush. It's just a way in which I'm trying to get us through and out of Bartholomew Fair. I think that perhaps what Jonson is suggesting is that it's precisely under conditions of carnivalesque festivity that law, rules, or norms are absurd. So I think Jonson is giving us this representation in this play of extreme, incoherent, incontinent carnivalesque festivity. And I think he's arguing that festivity, that we misunderstand it if we think of it as a kind of Kit Kat relationship to ordinary life, as though we take a break from rules and norms and then come back. I think what Jonson is suggesting is that festivity of the kind that he's representing in Bartholomew Fair, it actually consists in an irrational, incoherent relationship to law. In the space of Bartholomew Fair, and it matters a lot, I think, that we have all kinds of order and authority in the fair, policemen, stocks, Justice Overdue, and so on. We enter the space of Bartholomew Fair, or a space like that, thinking, oh great, now there's no rules. And yet, precisely by thinking that, or having that hope or fantasy, we place ourselves most abjectly, most slavishly under the command and the authority of law and rules. It's when we, I think Jonson is saying, it's when we lay aside or throw aside our own disciplined morality that we most need and submit to external discipline and morality. Like Trouble, who is so completely out of control, so completely not in charge of himself, that he needs Justice Overdue's warrant to be able to do or say anything at all. So Trouble is kind of a weird figure in this festive play because he keeps coming on saying, where's your warrant? Where's your warrant? Where's your warrant? A kind of obsessive insistence on and assertion of dogmatic or fascistic authority. I think what Jonson is saying with that figure is that that's exactly where carnivalesque festivity leads. Trouble seems like a non-festive character. I think Jonson is presenting him as the ultimate festive character. When we lay aside our own discipline, I think Jonson is saying, all that means is that we submit ourselves to others' discipline, others' power, others' authority. It's 7 p.m. here, and people are thanking healthcare workers, and I thank them too, but we're going to continue. Jonson's festivity. In Bartholomew Fair, Jonson is giving us a certain vision of festivity as a space where we lose control. I think what Jonson wants to argue for instead is a vision of festivity that is under control. And I think he's trying to suggest to us in this remarkable play that we pretty much have to have a festivity that is under control if we are to have festivity at all. And maybe, to give Jonson his due, we can note that we're accustomed to thinking of festivity as something that oscillates, right? We enter into it and then we have to leave it more or less under conditions of pain and regret. You get drunk, then the hangover. It seems like there's no alternative to that arrangement, so to speak, insofar as we have to have this relationship to festivity. Maybe Jonson is trying to chart a path toward an alternative vision of festivity where festivity doesn't really end. It doesn't really end because it doesn't really begin either. Rather, what we have, perhaps, in Jonson's humanist vision, is just a festive life. Moderately festive, but festive for all that. So, some questions with which we can round up our look at this play and our course. Festivity in early modern culture, and generally speaking, in terms of how we think about it, festivity seems to involve and be defined by disorder. I think Jonson is asking, can there be a festive order instead? If the world of Bartholomew Fair is the wrong way to do festivity, and I do think Jonson is presenting it as exactly that, the wrong way to be festive, the wrong vector down which festivity can go. If that's the wrong way, the world of Bartholomew Fair, what is the right way to do festivity? Is there one? Now, it's striking in this respect that this play, Bartholomew Fair, ends meta-theatrically. It ends with a play within a play, the puppet show. And that takes us back to the very beginning, the very presupposition of this work and of our look at it in this course. The theater, by definition, going to the theater, by definition, is festive time. When you lay your normal life aside, when you do something you would not normally do, when you pretend reality isn't real, when you watch a bunch of people who are dressed up pretending to be people they are not, that's festive time. The playhouse, by that token, is festive space, and we have talked about that before. After all of the disastrous mayhem of Bartholomew Fair in Acts 3 and 4, Jonson brings us back in Act 5 to examine that space and that time, the space and time of the playhouse itself, through the puppet show with which this incredible work concludes. And it's very difficult, I think, to give a comprehensive account of what Jonson is trying to achieve with the puppet show at the end of Bartholomew Fair. But let's try to say some things about it. Let's try to say what vision of the theater he is leaving us with. And one very simple thing I think we can say is that the puppet show scene in Act 5 of Bartholomew Fair is very, very funny. A central figure, of course, in the scene is our rich idiot Bartholomew Coates, who arrives at the puppet show having lost almost everything in the fair. He is a perfectly incontinent denizen of the festive incontinence of the fair as Jonson represents it. So he's not only lost all his money, he's lost most of his clothes. He comes on basically in his underwear, hose and doublet. and he has to beg money from John Littlewhite to be able even to come in to the play. Uh, Coates very excitedly wants to be introduced to the actors. It's difficult for him, I think, to grasp the actors are actually puppets. When he grasps that, he is no less interested in them. In fact, at one point, as the play is almost ready to begin, at one point, Coates is caught kind of feeling up the puppet who is going to play Hero, the female love interest of the play. So ridiculous, a very funny, a kind of comedy that is playing on Coax's naivety and stupidity. And in that way, the comedy that we have here in Act 5 around the puppet show is totally consistent with the kind of old comedy stuff that we have been watching Jonson do for the last number of weeks. At the same time, it's worth noting that we come into this puppet show through an extended introduction, the kind of thing that Jonson calls, in both of the plays we have read, an induction. And that means we come into the puppet show through a series of kind of framing stages which do not attempt to kind of shock us into the sense that we are watching something real. The attempt is not to produce an overwhelming illusion. The attempt is rather to kind of walk us into the play in the ongoing and constant consciousness that it is an illusion, that it is not real. And in fact, you know, when you're watching a puppet show, little, you know, wood and clay objects talking in ridiculous voices, it's pretty hard to lose sight of the fact that you are watching something that is not real. That's, I think, profoundly consistent with the vision of comedy that Jonson has and that Jonson wants, even as he's kind of making fun of himself a little bit, because we're looking at bloody puppets, right? They are trivial and crude, but it's through these vessels, these elements, that Jonson is leaving us with a kind of one more try to explain how he thinks comedy should work. The story of the puppet show, of course, is a classical tale. It's the story of Hero and Leander. Hero, a beautiful young woman who catches the eye of Leander, a handsome, heroic young man who dies while swimming the Hellespont in Constantinople in an attempt to get to her. This story of Hero and Leander had been rendered into unbelievably gorgeous English poetry in the 1580s by the brilliant Christopher Marlowe. So we have high humanism, a play about Hero and Leander, and yet it's being done with puppets. It's being done with puppets, and the story has been transferred to London. So it's all kind of dumbed down. And, you know, with apologies for yet another cop-out with respect to Jonson, it's difficult to know how to take that. On the one hand, you would think Jonson is delighted by the idea of a puppet show with a classical theme. On the other hand, it's dumbed down, which perhaps would not delight him. On the other hand, if you can make this material accessible to a local audience, well, what could possibly be wrong with that? As I suggested weeks ago when we looked at Jonson's poetry in comparison to Donne's, Jonson, I think, really wants what is best for us. He is highly learned and somewhat snobbish, but he profoundly believes in this conservative humanist vision of improvement, moral improvement of everybody, I think, through literature. So let's put it this way. The puppet show of Hero and Leander is a pretty good comedic representation of the way Jonson thinks humanism can and should be brought to the people. And the nature of the comedy in the puppet show, it's low. It involves violence. It involves scatology too. It's low, the comedy of the puppet show, but of course, from Jonson's point of view, comedy is supposed to be low. It is that low genre in the hierarchy of decorum that we have talked about. At the same time, this low comedy that Jonson has given us in the puppet show, and I'm not going to be able to look at it in detail with you guys. I'm just going to have to summarize what happens here. This low comedy is unbelievably complex and absolutely brilliant, I think. You have Leatherhead, the puppet master, the one who is putting on the puppet show. We have Leatherhead, for example, constantly responding and interacting with the audience. Bartholomew Coax in the audience, keeps asking questions. Leatherhead patiently answers them. Even though Coax is interrupting the show, he patiently answers them, explains what the puppets are saying, acting really very much like a chorus for his own puppet show. As the mayhem of the puppet show develops, Leatherhead at one point gets beaten up by his own puppets. I mean, that is brilliant and daring and astonishingly funny, I think. Even as, and to repeat a point that I've already made, even as all of this stuff that happens in the puppet show resolutely functions to prevent loss of the illusion. We go through this whole puppet show without ever, so to speak, losing ourselves. Even Coax, Bartholomew Coax, the absolute idiot of this play, is under no illusions that what he's watching isn't an illusion, if you see what I mean. We have, I think, in the puppet show, an absolutely brilliant vision from Jonson about the way he thinks the theater and comedy should work. And it should not work, in Jonson's view, I think, as a kind of overwhelming mechanism of loss of control on anybody's part. We should remain human, as it were, throughout the experience of watching the play. And in Jonson's vision, that is how its therapeutic effect can take hold. And it's very important in that respect, and we'll move toward the conclusion of the lecture now, that there is somebody who loses control, who loses sight of the fact that he's watching an illusion in the puppet show in Act 5 of Bartholomew Fair, and that, of course, is the Puritan zeal of the land busy, who comes storming in and engages in a debate with the puppets. Not with Leatherhead, the puppet master, because Leatherhead says, well, I'm not very knowledgeable about these matters. But this puppet knows, and the puppet Dionysius debates with zeal of the land busy. I mean, it is a masterpiece, this little moment, leading to the climax of the argument when zeal of the land busy, and I'm just going to summarize what happens, I think. Zeal of the land busy, he's debating this puppet. He's not having the best time in the argument. It's not going quite as well as he wanted, because that's a smart puppet, yo. Finally, Zeal of the land busy falls back on what he considers to be his absolute knockdown argument, which is that the theater is morally perverse because it involves cross-dressing. And I've mentioned this before. The early modern English stage was a transvestite stage in which all parts, both male and female, are played by men. Busy throws this out at the puppet. You're an abomination because the male of you puts on the dress of the female. And the puppet, in a moment of just sheer comic brilliance on Jonson's part, The puppet responds by lifting up its garment and demonstrating that neither it nor its fellow puppets has any genitals, and therefore Busy's argument falls to the ground. It is defeated. Busy then recognizes that he has been defeated, and he says, and I will turn to this, excuse me, it's almost at the very end of the play. It's on page 190 in our course books. Busy admits that he has been defeated in argument. I'm now on page, Act 5, Scene 6, line 111 on page 190. Busy says, "I am confuted, the cause hath failed me." The puppet Dionysius says, "Then be converted, be converted." Leatherhead says, "Be converted, I pray you, and let the play go on." Busy says, "Let it go on, for I am changed, and will become a beholder with you." And he sits down, having been transformed, to watch the play. An incredible moment in which Zeal of the Land Busy, a vitriolic opponent of the theater, is transformed as though into another person by the experience of the theater itself. Now, what Jonson is pointing at there is a very, very profound business, I think, which we would be able to track certainly throughout Shakespeare's works and all the way back to ancient times. It is the effect of what Aristotle calls catharsis, which is the purging of terror and pity that is supposed to occur on the tragic stage. When we watch terror and pity in the tragedy, in that ancient vision, the encounter with art is supposed to transform us. It's supposed to convert us. A process and experience that can only occur if we make ourselves helpless before that phenomenon, if we lose ourselves in the experience of, for example, watching the play. Jonson gives us that vision here with Zeal of the Land Busy. But here's the thing, in Jonson, it's trivial and it's ridiculous. It is precisely the idiot Bartholomew Coax who is, let's say, most at home in the world of the theater, the pretend world, thinking puppets are real, and so on. It's precisely the hypocrite, the Puritan Zeal of the Land Busy, who is converted by the experience of watching the play itself. And this is a very remarkable and I think rather painful thing in this moment of Jonson's play, because that's not the vision that he wants. He wants a vision, as I have said, of the theater and of literature, not as cathartic, not as transforming us in an overwhelming way, but rather as therapeutic, as improving us, fixing us, augmenting us rationally and, so to speak, little by little. And that may or may not be a compelling vision from our point of view, I don't know, but that is Jonson's vision. Controlled festivity. This play ends, Bartholomew Fair ends with the farcical business of the play, of course, coming to an end, with disguises being revealed, with people being shocked by the illusions that they have held. And finally it ends with Judge Overdue, who realizes what a fool he has been, inviting everybody home for dinner. The play goes home. It becomes normal. And I think that's consistent with what I'm trying to talk about Jonson's vision of controlled festivity. In Jonson's conservative humanism, we can't benefit from losing ourselves in the encounter with art. We have to maintain control of ourselves. As I've said, it's only idiots and hypocrites who really get changed in the Playhouse. Therapeutic, not cathartic. That's where we end up. And who knows, maybe under present circumstances that doesn't sound too bad. Okay, you guys, I'm going to wrap up there. Not, I think, very sententiously. But I just will say thank you very much for watching these lectures, and also thank you very much for all of your work and your contributions in the course. Before we had to go online, this was a great course for me. I certainly learned a lot from it, and I hope that you guys learned a little bit too. So I'm going to finish up there, and I'll look forward to receiving your term papers, and you will be hearing from me on final exam day, if not before. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.